This is Craig Marker, and today we're going to be talking about the Trivariate model. I'm going to give a little bit of history behind this model, and then Emily is going to give us a little brief presentation on an example of this model. So we're both from Mercer University in Atlanta, Georgia. So a little bit of history, and this is one of my favorite articles. It's from 1979, and it's by Lee Cronbach and Lita Furby, and it's How Should We Measure Change, or Should We? And I think that or should we is quite a big question. And at the time, measuring change was somewhat difficult, and there were different methods of doing it, and people weren't sold on the different methods. The simplest method was to do a simple difference score. So a simple difference score is just take time 2 and then you subtract time 1 from it. And that difference, the subtraction outcome, is what's thought to have changed. And there are some issues with this, is that, it's dependent on the metric that it was originally set at. That difference might be changed. It could also be other things. There's error built into it. So it's not a perfect way of doing this. Another method that came about was this residual change score. And this is still used quite often. Same with the simple difference score, is still often used. But the residual change score uses regression. And we're going to predict time 2 by time 1. And what's left over, what isn't predicted in time 2 by time 1, is thought to be change. And that makes very intuitive sense. That, if we know a lot about time 2 based on time 1, and what's different is how people have changed. And so this sounds like a reasonable method as well. It doesn't make as much sense like if you're losing weight. A simple difference score, you can just say I've lost X amount of pounds. A residual change score, it's in a different metric, it's a residual, so it doesn't make as much intuitive sense. Mathematically, it maybe makes a little bit more sense. But there's still some issues with this. One of the issues is that we're assuming that time 1 and time 2 are measured perfectly. So they're perfectly reliable. There's no error in these measures. And that's one of the biggest cruxes in that Furby and Cronbach article, that when we measure change, there's always error, and that error can be sometimes assumed to be change. So this is the model we're going to present. And it's a very big model on the page right now. I'm going to break it down into its separate components. So that first component I'm going to go over is at the very bottom. So I'm going to just look at this little bottom piece, and what's in the square is what's actually measured. So in this example here, and the example Emily's going to talk about, is with children's internalizing disorders. So children's internalizing disorders is the square in the middle, and you can think of it as being made up of 2 parts. So the parents filling out this measure, they know about the child's internalizing issues. So the true part, that top circle, is the latent child internalizing disorders. And then we have also the error, some things the parents might not know about or might have guessed wrong about. There's the error component. So we think of a measure of being made up of these 2 components, the true component and also the error component. If I bring it back to the model, you can see where that initial part was. Now let's look at a little bit higher up on that model. So now that we have a true score, a true internalizing score, we can look at it a little bit more. And this is what's called the latent difference score. And I learned this from my mentor, Jack McCardle. Him and Aki Fumagami came up with this latent difference score type modeling. And it gets around one of the biggest concerns that we have with the residual change score, is we can actually pull out the error. So again, in this slide, I think it's pretty important to point out, we're pulling out the error, the part that's not the true child internalizing problem. So by pulling out the error, we get around one of the biggest problems of Cronbach and Furby. And then again, let's look at the next component of this, and this is where Jack McCardle really kind of built this model up to be even better. So if I have time 1 and time 2, or in this case, it's first grade and third grade. That's why there's a 1 and a 3. I'm measuring these. The square boxes are what we measure. And then we have a pure time 1 measure. The error that I had on the bottom, I just left it off of the slide. So there's the L child, the latent child. That's the pure child internalizing at time 1. And then the one right next to it's the pure child internalizing at the third grade. We can look at how time 1 predicts the third year, And then we have a different score. That triangle or delta is the difference between time 1 and time 2. And so the biggest advantage of this over the residual change model is we've pulled the error out of this measure. This is the pure child internalizing, and we're left with this change score that doesn't have the error in it. One of Cronbach and Furby's biggest issues with this model. So from here, on that very bottom, we've got a change score for the child. Now, if we look at the picture, kind of in the bigger picture, we've also got two parents. So I've got here the child on the bottom, and we've got the same thing going on for the father. And in the father, we're looking at depression scores. So the father's depression, we did the exact same process. I left the errors off the bottom just to simplify this slide a little bit. But we have a change in the father's depression from first grade to third grade. And also on the bottom, we have the change in the child's internalizing from time 1 to the third grade. And so what we can do with this, now that we have two people in this model, we can look at how these two people interact with each other. So I've got this arrow going from the latent child internalizing in the first grade all the way to the father's depression, the change in father's depression. So where the child is in the first grade, their internalizing problem, does that predict father's depression or the father's change in depression from time 1 to time 2? And so we're looking at how the child might affect the father's change process. We are also looking at, if we look at it, we've got the father's depression in the first grade, and we look at, does that affect how much the child's internalizing changes from first grade to third grade? So if a father is depressed, does a child start developing more internalizing behaviors from the first grade to the third grade? So we can look at this reciprocal relationship and how one person might be affecting another person's change process. And so this is pretty unique. This is the bivariate latent difference score model that McCardle and Fumiyami came up with. And then what we've added to this model is we just built it out. We had a situation, we have two parent families, and we wanted to see how both parents affected the child. Also, we wanted to see how the child was affecting both parents. So we're looking at father's depression, mother's depression, the change in mother's and father's depression, and child internalizing behaviors, and the change in child's internalizing. So we can see how all three participants are affecting each other's change process. And maybe even a protective factor. Maybe one of their processes is blunting the response or blunting the change process. We don't know if it's a negative relationship. We're just looking at how they interact with another person's change process. We can build this model out even further. We've got this data going up from first grade all the way to age 15. So I'm going to leave a lot of this out of the model, but I'm only going to present the child. So we can look at the bigger picture of this model as well and build out from first grade all the way to ninth grade. And I'm only presenting the child data on the bottom because the model just gets really messy to diagram if I put it for all the family members. But we can think of this same pattern for the father and the mother as well. They're measured at the same time points. So we can look at the child changing from first grade to third grade, from third grade to fifth grade, from fifth grade to sixth grade, and then on, and then see how these other parents, the parents play a role in that child's change process. And similarly, the reciprocal, how the child affects the parents' processes. So with this trivariate model, we can model the dynamics of change in three variables, or in this situation, three different people.
As Dr. Marker said, my name's Emily, and I'm going to be talking about the application of the trivariate model to clinical data. More specifically, I'm really going to be looking at modeling that dynamic interaction between mother, father, and child. And a lot of my research is centered around mental health disorders in youth, given that there's a high prevalence of those disorders in youth, as well as a persistence into adulthood. And this prevalence suggests that we really need to examine the environmental contributors to the development and maintenance of childhood disorders, to get a better understanding and learn how to target it better in treatment. So I looked at the parental psychological distress research because that is a contributor to the mental health problems in youth. And parental psychological distress is found to be associated with an increased likelihood of mental health disorders in youth. Interestingly, the research that I looked at really emphasized maternal and paternal psychological distress separately in the literature. So that interaction of the paternal and maternal psychological distress that likely affects the child is really, really understudied. So that's something that I wanted to address in the literature, is being able to look at that interaction. What I also wanted to be able to address is this reciprocal relationship. So oftentimes we're not looking at how children, for example, children internalizing behaviors may influence parent psychological distress over time. And children are now seen as an active contributor to the family environment and context, how the family system runs. So it's really important that we study them as well and how they influence the parents. So the present study really seeks to examine psychological distress in the family unit to determine whether one member's psychological distress influences the other member's psychological distress. And our hypothesis is that parental psychological distress will influence child internalizing behaviors over time. Also, that child internalizing behaviors over time will influence parental psychological distress, and that parent psychological distress, so both mother and father, will influence each other over time as well. And we used some data from the NICHD database. There was about 1,300 families, and they were examined from birth to age 15. We looked at a subset of that data. We specifically used measures that looked at child internalizing behavior. So that was the child behavior checklist. That was both mother and father report. We also used a measure for paternal anger, which was the state trait anger scale, and parental anxiety, and that's state trait anxiety inventory. So these measures were assessed from grades 1 through 9, and the approximate ages were about 6 to 15. So we, again, looked at parent anger, parent anxiety, and child internalizing behaviors. And remember, we are doing a trivariate latent difference score model. So we're looking how mother affects change in child and father, how father affects change in mother and child affects change in mother and the father. And I'll put this model up on the screen so you can better see it. So I'm looking at father anger, mother anxiety, and child internalizing behavior, how all of those influence later change in the other over time. So it looks like in this model, father anger predicts later change in mother anxiety and child internalizing behavior. Mother anxiety also predicts later change in father anxiety and child internalizing behavior, but the level of child internalizing behavior does not appear to predict later change in father anger or mother anxiety. So to summarize, there seems to be a bidirectional relationship between paternal anger and maternal anxiety. It also appears that father anger and mother anxiety predict change in child internalizing behaviors. So what does this mean? So first of all, it's clear that depending on the presenting psychological issue, each family member is differentially impacted. So this can be applied clinically, also can be applied in research, that we need to be looking at a bigger picture, maybe at more of the family system than just a dyad. Another takeaway, again, is historically we have been looking at dyads within a family subsystem, which has been a wealth of information. We now also have advanced statistical techniques that are allowing us to examine more intricate family units so we can get a bigger, more complete picture of functioning. So this model was really helpful in determining how each family member impacts the other, and I think it could continue to be important in research and in modeling dynamic relationships in other areas as well. I really appreciate you taking time to watch this, and I know Dr. Marker does as well. If there's any questions or any suggestions that you have for us, our emails as well as a link to our lab is up online if you would like to reach out to us. Thanks so much for taking time to watch us.